another episode of Unlocking California Politics. I am Sanjay Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for the California Association of REALTORS. We will be talking with Mike Falk, C.A.R.'s Public Policy Economist. Mike received his bachelor's degree from Loyola University of Chicago and his Master of Public Policy from the University of Chicago. He specializes in data analysis and visualization and conducts economic impact analysis on housing and tax issues to support C.A.R.'s advocacy. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks, Sanjay.
So let's start with a topic which is at the forefront for California realtors, Proposition 33, which is proposing to eliminate the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act. Costa-Hawkins has stopped extreme forms of rent control from being enacted by local governments in California. Specifically, some of the most important provisions of Costa-Hawkins are those that prevent rent control on single-family homes and allow for vacancy decontrol. And I think one of the most important parts is prevent rent control on new construction. Before we go into those provisions, first let's talk about rent control. So does rent control work? And if so, why are all of our most expensive cities those which have had rent control for decades and decades?
So I think that the short answer is that rent control does not work. And before I even get into why and in the ways that it's a flawed policy, I always kind of like to start talking about an economic issue by looking at what the goal is of that policy. And for rent control, which is really just a blanket term for rent stabilization, vacancy control, and different measures, the goal is to limit rent increases and to maintain affordability. That's why it's been a policy that's been proposed. And there have really been two generations of rent control in the United States. One was right after World War II. It was a very kind of strict price control cap. And then in the 70s and recently, we've seen this second generation, which is more rent stabilization and different things like that, limiting how much rent can go up year over year, which we have in California with the Tenant Protection Act. So that's why it's proposed. But in reality, these policies come with a host of unintended consequences. It comes with a host of unintended consequences. And it's one of the rare issues that almost all economists agree is a flawed policy. It's one of the first things you read in an Econ 101 textbook as being a flawed policy. You got like the conservative godfather, Milton Friedman, who's against it, all the way to our current liberal darling, Paul Krugman, who's against it. It's kind of funny. I mean, most issues economists are all over the place, but this is actually one area where we all come together, and as a consequence, no one listens to us about it. They tend to listen when we're arguing. It comes with these unintended consequences, the first of which is it dampens new construction. Developers look at a market, a housing market, and just like any other investment, they want a return on their investment. And if there are strict rent control policies that cap how much rent they can charge, they'll say that's not a good market for me to invest in, and they'll stay away. It has a very chilling effect on new construction, which is why in Costa-Hawkins that's exempt, because otherwise, developers just wouldn't bother. It also tends to lead to less maintenance in units in part because these landlords may not be able to afford it because they're not getting a decent return, or they may just not be interested in it because they know these units won't be profitable. It has been shown to lead to an erosion of tax bases. It shifts tax burdens to homeowners, cuts down mobility because folks are really incentivized if they're in a rent-controlled unit to stay where they are no matter what happens in their lives. And if they get a different job somewhere else, they may not take it. They may stay right where they are. And ironically, ultimately, it does end up increasing housing and including rental costs, which is the first thing that the proponents want to limit. And so the short answer is no, and the long answer is also no.
So rent control doesn't work.
It hasn't yet, and I don't think it will.
So What are some of the studies that you're aware of that have talked about rent control?
Yeah, there are three studies that I like that are especially kind of important for our conversation today. The first is a study out of MIT from 2014 about the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts. I don't know very much about Cambridge other than that there's a university there that is very popular. Cambridge had a vacancy decontrol measure passed quite suddenly in the mid 90s. And what researchers found is that price appreciation and property values soared after this decontrol measure went into effect. And not just on the rent controlled units, but also on the already decontrolled units nearby. And the researchers really believed that that was because the increase in property values in the controlled units had a spillover effect on the decontrolled units, and the whole market kind of flourished in the aftermath of this. The second study that I really like is from San Francisco. This is a National Bureau of Economic Research article, I believe, or Stanford. I can't remember who exactly put it out, but this is for San Francisco. So this is right in our backyard. And they did a very rigorous study. I think 3/4 of that paper are formulas to obviously justify the expensive degree that these three researchers got. But what they found is what I said before, is that the rent control measures that San Francisco implemented in the 80s and 70s actually reduced rental supply by 15% on its own, causing a 5.1% increase in rental costs due to supply leaving the market. And you might ask, where did that supply go? What they found is that that supply went to condominium conversions. Landlords would change the composition of their units to have maybe less units, so they would be exempt, and then they wouldn't have to do it. And ultimately, it led to a 15% decline in the amount of renters in San Francisco and a 25% decline in the amount of renters in rental control units. And it really created a distortion in the market. And that, to me, because one criticism I've seen recently, like I said, most economists completely agree on this. And when you look at the literature, sometimes they're talking about the really strict first generation rent control measures, where it was like a straight price ceiling, which creates all sorts of problems. And that's Econ 101. But I've seen, and when I was going through school, there have been a little bit of pushback on that, saying that these second generation policies are more moderate and that we need to be looking at a case-by-case basis. And I actually sympathize with that. So when I think about a case-by-case basis, and we're in California, and I look at San Francisco and I see what happened, that's a good enough case-by-case basis for me that these policies distort the rental market.
Meaning even the more moderate, quote unquote, moderate rent control policies create these distortions.
Right. And then the last one is actually St. Paul, Minnesota. This one's especially interesting to me. I think it's very important for what we're talking about now, because in 2021, St. Paul put a 3% cap on rental increases. And for a while, I don't even believe that they had new construction exempt. And what happened is the next year, 48%, or nearly half of multifamily permitting applications, 48% decline. An estimated loss of about $1.6 billion in property value, 4% decrease in property tax revenue, which has to be made up somewhere else. And since then, they've rolled back some of the maybe more harsh aspects of the policy. But I think that the St. Paul example really gives us a good glimpse of what can happen when a city is empowered to really put some strict sort of policies in place, and the immediate effects, the immediate chilling effects that can have on the rental market. Even before these policies, really get into full swing, they have an immediate chilling effect. And so I think it's a very good sort of litmus test for when we're talking about some of the provisions of Prop 33.
What you just touched on, I think, is why you've had a lot of people who are even favorable to rent control urging a no vote on Proposition 33, which is it would have a chilling effect on new housing. I mean, would it be fair to say that if you're a NIMBY, somebody who does not want construction, putting a strict rent control ordinance might actually be helpful to you? That would affect, like if you had all limits were off and you could put it on new construction, that might be a way to actually stop development?
That's one of my concerns about Prop 33. And I actually, forgive me, I want to read a quote from 1973 from an economist who was referring to what at the time was called no-growthers. Today we would call them NIMBYs. And he said, there are individuals who see controls as socially and politically acceptable to prevent construction of additional rental units in their community. That was 50 years ago. And I feel that in the situation that California is in now, that even though that sentence was written 50 years ago, it's completely applicable now. Like we said, these measures can chill construction. They can chill new units, and they can really, ultimately raise rents. So it is a way to say, hey, we care about the character of our town or city or whatever, and that's why we support this, while also signaling that you care about tenants, you care about folks that are really struggling with their rent, because a lot of folks really are. But in reality, it's just another way to stymie growth, stymie construction, and more construction, more units that's what California needs more than anything. And we're not building enough right now. And to build even less is, in my economist opinion, bad.
So could you walk us through how Proposition 33 specifically would economically impact homeowners in California? Because currently, Costa-Hawkins prohibits the imposition of extreme rent control by local jurisdictions on single-family homes.
Right. So I think that for homeowners, if you have a home that you want to rent out, you have an ADU that you just built that you want to rent out, and these measures come into place, for those folks, it's going to also have a chilling effect. I mean, you can't get a return that you need to maybe cover the costs that you need. And, it's interesting to me that if you don't have a vibrant rental market in your city, you don't have folks coming in and renting and working and living there. If that market gets depressed, the whole economic ecosystem suffers as a result. And Californians need all types of housing. Everybody's in a different place in their lives. And, homeowners care about home values. And if towns really implement these measures like we saw in Cambridge, there are spillover effects. If rent-controlled areas those buildings are going into disrepair, those units are remaining vacant, it's going to affect homeowners too.
So if Prop 33 or a policy like it ever passes in California, I think you've hit on most of this, but what would ultimately the effect be statewide on housing supply and affordability?
Well, it wouldn't be great. You already have anti-growth city councils, and already in California, they have a lot of tools to slow development, to stymie development, to make it long, arduous, expensive to build anything at all. They already have a lot of tools. And I worry that Prop 33 would just be another tool, and a very powerful tool for them. Because the bottom line is that right now in California, we're not building enough. And I'm sure that anybody who's listened to me speak is bored with me saying this, but we aren't building enough already. In the 70s and 80s, I think we permitted, around 2 million, residential permits in each decade. In the 90s, it was 1 million. 2000s, it was 1.4. 2010s, it was 800,000. And so far, this is up to 2024, it's about 450,000. We're not building enough. And the demand to live in California has not gone away. And it's not just the weather. I mean, there are a ton of economic opportunities here, and we're not building enough. And as a consequence, there are not enough homes, and everybody wants one. Affordability is going to go down. And affordability, our housing affordability index, which the research and economics team at C.A.R puts out, which is the percentage of households that can afford a median priced home, is 14% right now, which means that 14% of households making median income can afford to buy a median priced home in their area. So if you're ever walking down the street and you want to count 1 out of 10 roughly of the people you pass, that's what we're talking about. And that is tremendously low. And it's the lowest since 2007. So anything that's going to make that worse is not what we need right now.
Yeah, I always imagine if this were to pass, you would have some of those cities that don't want growth. They would, as you mentioned, you could put a patina of, we care about the renters, and say all new construction, and you would put the most extreme number of limited rent increases, high registration fees, eviction controls, et cetera. That would basically mean you'll never have development in that city.
Yeah, and you'd be kind of sounding like the good guy while you're doing it.
Right. So now let's shift our conversation. It looks like we've concluded rent control bad. Something I think we've known, and as you mentioned, the economic consensus has been for quite some time that any form of rent control, but especially any type of extreme rent control, would be a real problem for tenants, homeowners, for frankly everybody in this state.
Well, it creates an unnatural sort of state of affairs. That's maybe how economists look at it, and maybe that's why it's been so unpopular. But like, to go back to Paul Krugman, when he talks about rent control, he's like, you don't need to tell me where it is. If you put a number of factors in front of me, I can tell you what's going on in a housing market. If you have high rents and uncontrolled units that desperate people are renting out, if you have limited new construction, fear of extension of the laws, forcing landlords trying to force tenants out, black market stuff going on like rent-controlled tenants, subletting to people and pocketing the difference, and then more regulations to crack down on those people. That's kind of what the distortions are that we're really talking about. It's not a great scene.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned some of the distortions, because one distortion, I used to live in Southern California, that you would sometimes see is a preference actually to rent in some of these units to much higher income tenants, because they'll do improvements on their own. They'll fix up the units, they'll do all sorts of things because they're happy to get a rent control, because there is no means testing for rent control, so that it often creates an incentive to get the wealthiest tenants into your property, because they'll do their own improvements. So.
Right. It's got such an imperfect targeting mechanism. And actually, some of the studies that I've read, in fact, most of the studies have shown that higher income folks tend to benefit more from these rent-controlled units than lower income households, a greater share anyway.
So now let's shift our conversation a bit to our today's housing market and what is predicted for 2025. How is today's housing market in terms of, just generally speaking? What are you seeing?
Well, I think for me, the big thing right now is that in California, about 2/3 of folks have mortgages below 4%. And they go out and look at current mortgage rates, which are 6.5-ish, and say there better be a very good reason for me to sell this house, because right now we're locked into something. It was really great. I mean, it was kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity. During the pandemic, it was kind of like free money for a while. And a lot of people locked down some really great mortgage rates. So they're staying put unless they have to. So that is constraining inventory across the state. And with inventory being constrained like that, prices are still pretty high. They're elevated. And I would say that prices are going to still continue to rise into 2025. The research team, and I think that they're going to go, the median price in California will break $900,000 next year. in part because inventory is so constrained and the amount of demand waiting on the sidelines to get into these limited amount of homes is still very high. I live in LA. My fiance and I are trying to buy a house, and those entry level homes that you think about, there a lot of competition for those homes, a lot of competition. So the demand's still high, the supply not so much.
At some point, you mentioned, so we have very low interest rates, meaning from the pandemic times, holding, in a sense, people into their homes. Isn't there just the sort of ebb and flow of normal, like, oh, I've got a new job, I have more kids? Are people just deciding, well, I'll commute a little more, I'll live in a slightly more crowded house rather than move? Is that what we're seeing? Like, even the normal ebb and flow is slower than normal?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're saving that much money a month on your mortgage, and let's say you want more space because you're starting a family, the house is getting more crowded, you might say, we don't need it that bad. We can put up with this. And then on the flip side, let's say you're an older empty nester and you're in a big house and it's just you, or maybe just you and your spouse. And you say, we'd like to downsize, but if we downsize, we're going to be paying more. So you have this mismatch where people are not always in the most ideal situation. And a lot of times in an environment like this where mortgage rates are so low for so many folks and they are locked in, the only thing that can really move the needle are very significant life events. Like, I mean, I don't want to be morbid, but like, death, divorce, or having to move for whatever reason. So yeah, I think a lot of those decisions are being delayed unless they absolutely have to.
So the Feds have recently cut the interest rate by 0.5 point. Many people expect us to see like, oh, great, 0.5 point. Mortgage rates will start to tumble. That hasn't happened. Can you explain how the relationship to some extent between Fed rate cuts and mortgage rates work?
Yeah. So this is kind of funny. So the Fed cut their overnight rates on September 18th. And after they did that, my mom called me and was very excited. She said, you're going to be getting into a house sooner now, right? And the answer to my mom and to everybody listening is not necessarily, because the bottom line is that mortgage rates actually really closely follow the 10-year Treasury market. And the 10-year Treasury market shifts daily, shifts with all sorts of economic news. And they had anticipated that federal funds cut, which was 50 basis points in September, pretty much weeks before it even happened, because there was a lot of economic data that suggested that, hiring slowing down, also inflation's going down a little bit. So they were like, oh, this is coming already. And so by the time that the Federal Reserve actually cut the rates, the rates had already gone down. And since then, they've actually, unfortunately, gone up. We've had a really strong job report. And now, Treasury yields are going up and mortgage rates, as they do, are kind of following them.
Any predictions on interest rates going forward into next year?
I mean, I think that if you were waiting for like a magic interest rate where you're like, now I can get a house, I would say stop waiting. I think that if you find the right place, it's worth going for it right now. I do think that next year they will drop, but I don't see them getting much lower than high fives next year. I really don't.
So are there policies that you think could actually help? As you mentioned, those affordability numbers are, if you're from anywhere else in the country, I mean, even for Californians, but especially if you're anywhere else in the country and you look at those numbers, you're like, the mind is boggling. And I forget the number. I want to say, I think we have 21 zip codes with a median price over $1 million. That's the last number I'd heard. And
Sounds about right.
are there things that could actually make a difference given where we are right now? I mean, it's true we have this inventory issue, but are there other things that could actually help move the envelope and helping get people into homes, relieve some of this pressure that we're seeing in California?
Yeah, I think that, I'm going to rattle off a few and we see what sticks. I think expanding the Dream for All program is a great idea. Any form of down payment assistance that folks can get will go a long way, because ultimately that's one of the biggest hurdles into getting a home ownership. That with how expensive they are, mustering enough for a down payment is a significant hurdle for a lot of folks. First-time homeowner tax credit, I think, would be very important. In fact, a number of the studies that I read about rent control suggested those kinds of credits as being a more targeted and efficient way to help with the housing affordability, instead of just a blanket policy that some folks could take advantage of and that some folks might not see any advantage from. And then, I would also, this one's going to seem kind of funny, but we did a consumer survey at C.A.R. and we found that, 47% of respondents think that you need over 22% to make a down payment on a home, to get into a home. And if there's any way to increase the financial literacy and explain how, these down payments work, and, different programs from, federal programs or whatever that can help you get into home ownership with a lower down payment, just increasing awareness about that, seems to be a really low hanging fruit to me. I was really surprised by those numbers, and, just communicating to folks that there are many ways to get into home ownership, I think is really important.
Yeah, I think I was actually one of those people prior to working to the California Association of REALTORS. I used to think, oh man, buying a house is such a big deal. And part of that is probably even earlier that, prices in the LA area are always kind of high. So it seems like such a huge thing. And when I actually did it, I was like, oh, this wasn't, I should have done this a long time ago. I don't know why I didn't think about it. It just seemed like such a big deal to get into a house. But
yeah, and I think if you pair that, like I said before, we're not building enough. So creating ways to streamline or accelerate construction or make it more, easier and quicker to get units on the market, it has got to be a top priority. I mean, we've been talking about rent control, which is something that takes that backwards. I think we, talking about ways to move that forwards in the future is also very important.
In the last few years, we've seen accessory dwelling units, ADUs, explode. I believe in places like San Diego, there's more ADUs being built than homes. People are building them on their properties, converting rooms, converting garages. First, why do you think we're seeing this explosion of ADUs? And has this benefited the housing market?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, we need units. Anywhere we can get units is good. And I think that ADUs have been a tremendous success, especially in Southern California. Like you said, in San Diego, they're stacking them on top of each other. In LA, they're popping up everywhere. And I think that, the biggest thing with ADUs is that they're cheap. They're not hard to build. They provide rental income, or they provide, housing for family members. And we've made it easier to build them. We've streamlined the process. We've made it easy. And, part of the exciting thing for me in ADUs is that, there are a lot of businesses sprouting up in LA. I see it all the time for, folks constructing ADUs. I mean, this is a real economic activity. And, just for my own nerdy self, it also shows that even in these single family kind of neighborhoods, there is still an appetite for what I would call, and other folks have called, gentle density, where you can increase the density of an area without, committing the cardinal California sin of making a high density unit. I mean, 2plexes, 4plexes, whatever. This is a form of that. And, I think that's a great thing. And it just goes to show the power of zoning, in effect. You make something easier, you open that up for folks. And if there's an opportunity, they'll respond, and they have. And I think they'll continue to do so.
Okay, Mike, I'm going to ask you for any closing remarks, but basically buy now seems to be, if you can, buy your home now.
That's what we're trying to do. Yeah.
Any other closing remarks about our housing market?
So my closing remarks would, like you said, be to buy now. Historically, where rates are right now isn't actually not so bad.
Right.
We have the recency bias of the pandemic, where borrowing became so easy. And we look at that and be like, you know what a low rate is? 2.5. Not only is 2.5 a low rate, it is a historic anomaly low rate. That is a crazy low rate. When you sign a 2.5% mortgage, you should have been dancing in the street, because it might not happen in a long time. So yeah, if you have the ability to get into a home, to get your foot on that ladder or get your toe in the door, or however you want to think about it, I would say, yeah, you should jump on that opportunity. A policy like this, it is so backwards looking and is couched in sort of these white knight terms, but will not help. And so, again, we need more units. We need to be building more, and we need new housing units of rental, affordable, home ownership, all of it, condos. So that's kind of what I would end with.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike.
Disclaimer. The purpose of this podcast, brought to you by the California Association of REALTORS, C.A.R., is to provide general and educational information and opinions from a wide range of perspectives regarding politics, voting, elections, legislative issues, and more. The opinions, beliefs, and views expressed by guests or participants of this podcast are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions, beliefs, or views of C.A.R., its affiliates, their respective directors, officers, or employees. Reference to any individual or entity does not constitute an endorsement, recommendation, or any other position or opinion regarding that entity or individual by C.A.R. This podcast does not constitute professional advice or services of any kind. This podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. You may not edit, modify, or redistribute this podcast.